Hello, I'm John Klobuchar with InEight, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar in our Project Cost Management series. Today's webinar is titled, Align Estimators and Schedulers for Greater Profitability. Our presenter today is Rick Deans, who is Executive Vice President of Industry Engagement at InEight. In his role, Rick works with InEight's largest and most strategic customers to ensure they're continuously getting value from the use of our tools. This includes working with clients during the pre- and post-implementation phase. He also heads up InEight's Industry Advisory Group, which provides valuable feedback to the company around industry best practices and product roadmap validation. Rick was part of the original Hard Dollar team and has been working with InEight customers for over 20 years. If you have any questions as you watch today's webinar, please submit them to webinars@ineight.com. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the video within the next week. Once again, we're glad you've joined us, and now let me introduce Rick Deans, who will take it from here. Rick?
Well, thank you, John. As we look back upon the year, I can't believe we're already into November, and the end of the year and the holidays are just right around the corner. So, wow, what a great year this has been. I really think this webinar series has gone really well. We've had some great attendance. So I wanted to thank our participants out there for joining and coming to yet another webinar. This presentation is on a topic that I feel very passionately about. I've worked with a lot of organizations, some small, some huge, to help them combine cost and schedule data to really help them become more efficient as they're executing projects out in the field. This really comes from an owner's perspective as well as a contractor's perspective, and I've even worked with some engineering firms on this same topic. A lot of what I learned doing this has made its way back into our products, either in the form of continuous improvements or net new features, and we're certainly not done yet with InEight's acquisition of schedule and risk management software juggernaut Basis. We're continuing to look at ways to provide more value to our customers by continuing to blur the line between cost estimating and scheduling/planning. To kind of tee this up, one of the things that I've certainly been hearing for a long time since I entered the workforce is that time is money. I think we've all heard that in one way or another when we started working for someone else. Project management principles also stress the interdependence of what they call the triangle, consisting on one side of the triangle of scope, the other side of the triangle, another side of the triangle would be time, and then the third element would be cost. So those things are inevitably tied together. There's an old construction joke that lets the customer pick two of the following at the expense of the third. So the three choices are cost, time, and quality. So basically, if you want it fast and cheap, it's not going to be good. If you want it good and fast, it's not going to be cheap, etc. So again, that's just another way of explaining that quality, scope, and cost are all tied together. And so clearly the concepts of time, cost, and timing aren't necessarily new. Let's explore why this special relationship is at the heart of a lot of construction projects. So in this webinar presentation, we'll take a look at some industry trends and explore these key issues and uncover some, hopefully, time and money saving techniques by integrating cost and schedule data. So as technology continues to improve, estimating and scheduling systems have become much more interactive. So for instance, when considering the impact of a scope change, not only can a cost estimate be created, but a view into the schedule's critical path and the overall project of the timing can be assessed at the same time. So that's one of the things we're going to look at, how changes to scope affect both cost and schedule. We're also going to take a look at the escalation of certain time-based costs. So, escalation can really be our friend in terms of understanding what is really going to be the cost of starting something early, starting something later, etc. We're going to talk about crew sizing and how it can impact durations and costs. And the discussion might not be exactly what you think it might be. I know sometimes we think, well, we just need to throw more resources at it, get it done quicker. But we'll talk about some real world implications associated with that train of thought, if you will. We're going to talk about how attributes in the form of data elements or data fields. So for instance, I'm thinking about area, system, component, who's responsible for this work. They can be assigned to activities in one tool and passed to the other. And a lot of our customers say, we really like to isolate or organize the estimate based on some of these attributes. We're really only interested in seeing things in area one. And I want to be able to do the same thing, for instance, in the schedule. If I've done that in the estimate, I want to be able to isolate or easily identify those items that are going to be impacted when I get into the scheduling tool. So we'll take a look at that as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about how some time-based costs, and these are typically indirects, can easily be accounted for and updated as changes are made to other parts of the project plan as well. So again, we got a lot of stuff to look at, so we're going to dig right in. And for those of you who have been on a few of these webinars with me, you know I always like to start off with some industry trends or some industry news and highlights just to try to validate, is this a problem worth solving? So I did a little research, and I came up with a couple of trends that are affecting construction projects. In this case, we're going to give credit to the Independent Project Analysis Group for publishing this data. One of the points that they make is more than 35%, greater than a third of all construction projects will experience a major change that will negatively impact productivity. So when we talk about impacts of change and we talk about productivity being impacted, some of these things are predictable, right? So we know that prevailing weather conditions could we can't always predict the weather, but that's something we know to look out for. Manpower and labor conditions in a specific region. Maybe we're doing a project in an area that has high demand for these resources, and again, that's something we can predict and we can rely on. The source of utilities. I was with a customer in Toronto a few weeks ago, and he was telling me how one of the big challenges that they face is just the sheer number of utilities on any of their projects. And sometimes they get the utility companies to go along and really help out. Other times they won't return their call. But again, this is a known unknown. This is something they can plan for. Is somewhat predictable that utilities are going to be an issue. Let's take a look at the other side of the coin. What are some things that maybe we can't predict or we don't really have any insight to at the time we're putting a cost estimate together to bid on the job? One of the big things on this list is client or owner directed changes. Now, if we've got a track record working for a particular client, particular owner, that's one thing. If we're working for a new customer and we don't really have a lot of experience or history with this particular organization, we don't know what's going to happen. I was working with a big mining operation that had a big project down in South America, and they were completely befuddled and baffled because the government there would declare holidays right in the middle of the week when they were fully expecting their workforce to show up at the job site, and we're just going to declare this as a paid national day of rest. And how do you plan for that? So there's changes that are going to happen. Some of them are predictable, and some of them aren't. So I just wanted to give you a little taste of that. But in this statistic, certainly better than a third of all projects are going to have some sort of a major change that's going to impact productivity. 25%, a quarter of all projects are going to slip by over 20%, and another quarter of all projects will grow past scope in the field by greater than 30%. So again, we're talking cost, we're talking schedule, we're talking the timing of projects, we're talking the cost of projects. So I would draw the conclusion that, this looks like a problem worth solving, and technology can certainly be our friend. Tying together data from a cost estimate as well as a schedule can help us get out in front of some of these things. We talked about some trends that are going on, and I always think it's fair to talk about how the industry is responding to some of these trends. One of the things that we're certainly seeing is more collaboration between organizations, and this can take on many flavors. I think about the relationships between prime contractors and subcontractors, for instance. I've seen that relationship evolve over the 2 decades I've been in this industry. Also think about joint ventures, right? 2 very large companies getting together to form an even larger organization for the purpose of executing a specific project. A lot of those JVs, they're all the way down to their own systems, their own ERP, which set of tools is going to be used. Those are all decisions that are being made as that joint venture is coming together. And then finally, let's take a look at different types of delivery methods for projects. There's a big push in the industry for IPD or integrated project delivery. I had the opportunity to talk to numerous customers that were involved in those types of projects, and just the fact that the collaboration and the value sharing between the owner, the engineer, and / architect and the contractor. They're not each looking out after their own best interests. They're actually looking out after the best interests of the project, so there can be some value savings there as well. So even to the point where you've got a guy in the field saying, why don't we shop weld these flanges? Maybe we need to re-engineer them. We can knock all those out in the shop. They can be delivered ready to install, and it can take a couple of days off our delivery time. That's really good information that now all of a sudden the engineer and the architect get together and say, yeah, that would be a good problem to solve. It looks like we could add some value back to the project that way, as opposed to each one just sort of looking out after their own interests. So another thing that I'm seeing is sort of the breaking down of silos within specific organizations. The line still exists, but I'm certainly seeing a blurring of the lines between the cost estimator role and the planner / scheduler role within the industry. More importantly, though, what's really refreshing to me and encouraging to me, I'm seeing a lot of forward-thinking organizations are doing some pretty exciting things to introduce a common language to really bring these two groups closer together. And they do look at projects through a different lens. Estimators, their responsibility is to make sure they've covered everything in the cost estimate, that the project, has a good probability of being built for that price. Where schedulers, obviously they're thinking about the relationship between the timing of the tasks. When's the earliest we can start this task? Well, we can't start this one until that one's finished, et cetera. But they seem to have a really good eye for the way things are going to come together in the field. And I think if we take the best of both worlds, now we're really putting together a detailed cost estimate that really has a lot of deference to the way the project's going to be built in the field as well. Sort of the best of both worlds, if you will. One of the things we're certainly seeing, we've been seeing this for years, is owners asking for or requiring schedules at the time of bid submission. And this takes on multiple flavors. If we were having this discussion 10 years ago, we'd be talking about A plus B bidding, right? A price plus a duration. We see this evolve as well over time. A lot of our customers are telling us, not only did we have to produce a commercial proposal that talked about how much the project was going to cost, but we also had to produce a technical proposal, basically outlining the fact that we understood the complexity of the work and we have a plan for attacking that. Interestingly enough, we've got a lot of customers that are contractors that don't really like that technical aspect of the bid solicitation process, not because they don't have a technical plan, but they feel like a lot of times they might get their really creative ideas sort of lifted and put into an RFP that the owner decides, hey, that's a great idea. We're going to require everyone do that. And it might whittle away a competitive advantage, but that's a story for a different time, I guess. But certainly we're seeing that in the industry, that owners are requiring schedules, and not only are they requiring schedules up front at bid solicitation time, but as the project is now under execution, they're managing to those schedules. So owners are typically asking for things like earned value, SPI, or schedule performance index measures as a project is in its execution phases. So it's not just show me a pretty picture to get the bid submitted, but I want to manage to that schedule. And then interestingly enough, we talked about changes affecting projects, and all of the changes, need to be dealt with in most cases without affecting the original end date of the project, which can be an interesting feat as well. All right, so let's go back to our list of items, and we'll explore each one of these in some level of detail, and we'll use our tools to facilitate this as well. So first one up, how changes to scope affect both cost and schedule. So let's dive into the tool, and we'll take a look at an example and see what this might look like. So I've got the InEight estimate tool up here, and it's this particular project has a little bit of everything. We'll just kind of explore the lay of the land here. It's got some civil earthwork. It's got some concrete, structural steel. There's certainly some work we're subbing out. We've got some supervision. We've listed our equipment out as a separate line item, as well as our equipment mobilization. I'm going to throw in a section here called changes, We know changes are going to occur, but let's see what a particular change might look like. So the reason I like to keep them sort of isolated is this is a potential change. It's not something that we've been given the go-ahead. And I really wanted to just sort of model it first, and I'll be in a position to answer questions about durations and costs and man hours and things like that without necessarily putting it into my estimate file. And in fact, those of you who have used our tools, you know that we've got some change control capabilities. The only thing I'm really going to do right now is I'm going to make sure that I've got this changes log activated. You can see the tick box there next to log PBS changes. That means that anything that I do at this point on that's going to affect the price, i.e. the costs or the markup of this project, are going to get logged automatically. And I'll just create a line item here called extra work requested by client. So this can be moving a water line. It could be extra excavation. It could be taking some extra stuff to a dump site, whatever the client has asked for. And then I'm going to estimate it just like I would any old cost item. I'm going to come in here and take a look at maybe some labor resources that I might use. Maybe I'm going to get a finisher apprentice, a finisher, and a finisher foreman. Maybe these resources are going to work for 5 days doing this task. And so it's generating a cost for me. It's added $3,900 to my estimate. Those are direct costs only. And again, 5 days of work. Now, a question I need to ask myself is this on the critical path? How is this going to affect other activities? Maybe in this case, it's just an ancillary work item, and it's not really going to draw resources away from anything else. So in this case, pretty straightforward. I've got my $3,900 and my duration associated with that. For those of you playing along at home, you notice I checked to see if that changes log was on, which it was. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a look at this change, and I'm going to see what the impact of that change was in terms of not only my direct cost of $3,900, but I'm also interested in seeing any indirects that were associated with that, maybe any markups that I had associated with that as well. And then I can also see down at the item level what that difference looks like, all the way down to the impact and the difference on man hours and equipment hours. So the net of it is it added 150 man hours to my project. So pretty easy to now throw this over to the schedule if I wanted to put it in with the logic ties there as well. So I can just schedule this item with the changes, and then I'm going to just do a push. I'm going to come over here to where the estimating functions are in the ribbon. I'm going to come to schedule. I just happen to be using Primavera. This works pretty much the same with Microsoft Project, and you can also manually throw dates in these date fields as well. So I'm going to update Primavera from estimate, and we'll take a look at what some of those options do in a moment. And now it's pushing the data over, and then when I get back to Primavera, I'm just going to hit my F5 button, sort of refresh my screen, and you can see here are my changes. And it even brought my resources over so I can share resource data. And in this case, I'm looking at my durations in terms of hours in Primavera. So that 50 hours of duration came over from the estimate where I said it was going to take 5 days, and we were working a 10-hour day. So that's where that 50 hours of duration came through. So pretty cool. I've estimated this. I now can talk to the customer. I can tell them that the net impact of the change, again, my direct cost only is going to be $3,900. I could layer on some indirects, some profit on top of that, as well as show what that may look like in the schedule. And if I wanted to tie this to other activities within the schedule, I could show the change on critical path, etc. So a pretty cool set of capabilities. So again, in our cost estimate, we made a change. We understood what the impact was in terms of direct and indirect cost. If it was on the critical path, we could certainly assign its logic ties, identify its successors, predecessors, and see what that does to our critical path. And one of the things we're going to talk about here in a second, it might make more sense to kind of set that up, is what is the impact on any kind of escalation date ranges that we might have set up. All right. So that's going to be important. And then another thing we need to consider too, and I touched on this briefly, is, does this extra work activity require us to divert critical resources from other tasks? So again, maybe this involved some heavy lifting. I have one crane on site, and now I have to use that crane for something else. Then obviously we can't do those activities in parallel. They'll need to be done in succession. I'll have to finish one before I can move the crane back and do the other one. And that doesn't just apply to big pieces of heavy equipment. That could apply to long lead items with materials. It could also apply to work in isolated areas where maybe we just can't go down and get more folks to come in and work. Maybe we've got a camp situation where the people really need to be mobilized in ahead of time, and there's a process associated with that, and to do extra work would pull resources away from other planned activities. So that's an important consideration as well. So we'll tie these together here in a little bit, and I think you'll see what's going to happen when we talk about the next item on our list, which is escalation of certain time-based costs. And typically we see this happening with labor and materials. So let's kind of talk about this for a moment. Sometimes we have a really good understanding of when certain types of costs are going to change. For instance, union labor agreements are famous for going into effect on a specific day by a specific amount. So the Boilermakers Union Local 325 has said, beginning July 1st, 2020, these are going to be the new rates. So relatively easy to plan for. Sometimes material costs escalate. Certainly if we're doing something under contract with a provider, a lot of times those unit prices for the materials are valid up until a certain date. They may not say what it's going to change to beginning October 1st, but that's certainly something that we can tie in. And then certainly anticipating scarcity of particular materials as well. Again, if long lead items, maybe you're working in a remote area and it's not that easy just to run down to the corner and get some more stuff. We need to have that brought in from overseas. Those are all considerations as well. And then rental rates for third-party equipment. A lot of times our customers might rent something by the week, thinking they're only going to need it for a week or two. They don't want to commit to the full month rental rate. And then if they're asked to do some extra work, let's consider the fact that, okay, now we might have to rent this thing by the month. What is that going to do to the cost of my third-party rental equipment? So let's jump back in the tool, and I'll show you how our customers plan and manage for this set of events. And this part up here above the colored lines and the cost breakdown structure, these are primarily what we call dependent cost items. Their cost depends on other factors or other variables, other costs within the estimate. And so there's a line item here called labor and materials escalation. And what's kind of nice about this is we can put a year one escalation here, and we can choose when we want those escalation date ranges to kick in. So I'm going to come in here and say, I really want this to go into effect on January 1st of 2020. And this project just happens to be only a year in length. It starts in 2019, it ends in 2020. So I'm just going to say, I only want to escalate costs that are going to occur from January 1st, 2020 to the end of the project. And then what's happened on the right side of the screen is these subject costs have changed. So I know I can see right here, right away, that I'm going to have $78,000, call it $78,496 of labor costs occurring after January 1st. And if I felt that they were going to increase by 5%, I could put a percentage in here. I could do the same thing for materials. I've got $605,000 of materials that we're expected to pay for after the first of the year. Maybe I'm expecting those to go up by 3.5%. So fairly easy to dial in different escalation costs by date range. And in this case, I've accounted for a little over $25,000, $21,200 with my material escalation and $3,900 with my labor escalation. So I've added another $25,000 to the estimate, where I'm really expecting to pay those extra dollars based on these escalation ranges. Now, if we go back to the example we did a moment ago where we created that new change record, we could have put that in scheduled at January 1st, and guess what that would have done? That would have added another $3,900 to my labor total, in which case it would have pushed that value up, I would have kept my same 5%, and it would have calculated some additional escalation on top of that. So again, by combining the schedule data as well as the cost estimate data, fairly easy to see how those costs are going to impact the estimate, including things like escalation. So let's talk a little bit about changing crew sizes and how that can impact durations and costs. And, on its surface, the idea makes sense. We've got a situation where maybe we're doing some greenfield construction, and, we can put as many bodies out there as we need to. And yeah, if we triple the number of crews, we would have an expectation that we'd get done in a third of the time. We'd have 3 times as many people being productive out there on the job, and that's going to drive our schedule down. But what happens if there's a limit to the amount of people we can throw in an area, right? We consider this to be a congested area. In this case, we may or may not achieve the desired result if productivity is impacted due to the sheer number of bodies in a space-restricted area. Maybe there are some specialized craft or some specialized subcontractors that are going to be coming in and doing the work for us, and we realize that we just can't reproduce them at will. We just can't hand out shovels to everybody and expect them to triple our productivity if there's something very technical or very specialized being done. Another thing we need to consider is the skill level and the experience level of the craft labor. I've seen a lot of situations where people think, hey, we're behind on the schedule. Let's just get some people in there and let's bang this out. But unfortunately, the people that they're bringing in don't have the requisite skill, or maybe there's not enough supervision to go around and monitor their quality, and we end up doing a lot of rework. So in this case, we may end up taking longer and costing more. So again, whenever we talk about affecting crew size to affect the schedule, let's be cognizant of what it is we're really trying to do. If it might make sense under certain conditions, but in other cases, as I said earlier, it might end up costing us more and taking us longer. So those are all things we need to consider. I'll show you in the tool sort of one of the ways that we manage this. And I'll go back to my extra work request by the client. And there's a little switch in here that asks me when I already have a cost item that's estimated that has a productivity rate. This is asking me here, when I change the number of labor resources, when the man count changes, what do I want to do? So one of the values that we can hold constant is the units per man hour, or the man hours per unit, or just the man hours if you want to think about it that way. Another thing that we can hold constant is the duration of the activity. So it almost sounds like a math problem, doesn't it? But I'm saying when the man count changes, change the days. So what that will do is that will change our duration. So let's go back and take a look and see what that means. So right now, this activity is going to take 5 days, or based on my 10-hour day, it's going to have a duration of 50 hours. Let's see what happens if we start putting in some additional resources here. So if I brought in some additional finishers to do this work, watch what happens to my duration. See, it's going down. It went from 5 days to 3 days, and now we're at a little over a day. I'm going to put in 2 foremen to watch these guys, and now we're down under 2 days. So I took this from a 50-hour duration activity down to about just under 20 hours. And let's see what that does to the schedule now, right? So I'm going to do a push, update the schedule from the estimate. The magic is done. Let's go ahead and update the schedule now. And you'll see my extra work activity is now 18.75 hours, just as we had estimated it. So again, if this were sitting in the middle of some activities with predecessors on one side and successors on the right-hand side, we would have seen how this might have impacted the overall duration of that chain of activities. All right. So again, changing crew size in some cases can help us get the work done a little faster, but I don't want to paint with such a broad brush and say every time you change the number of people on a crew, you're going to get the job done quicker because of those reasons we mentioned earlier. We really need to think through, does it make sense? Maybe in this case, it's blow and go kind of work. They're not going to be tripping all over each other, especially if we just bring in another handful of guys. All right. So use your judgment and your knowledge there with that one. Okay. Now we're going to talk about how certain attributes or data elements, data fields can be shared between a cost estimating tool and a schedule tool. So what are some of the data elements? Well, as we saw earlier, we can certainly share resource data. And if that wasn't entirely obvious, let's go back and take a look. You'll notice that not only did the budgeted units of these resources update, but what we call the units per time, or the quantity of those resources, was updated as well. So a lot of times our customers will say, as I'm getting ready to put this bid proposal together, I also need to include a schedule showing how the work is going to be done. And in this particular case, because it's perhaps a reimbursable project, the client is asking me to also include the resource loading of that schedule. So again, if they're taking advantage of tools like ours, very easy to turn this into a resource loaded schedule, just as you saw me do earlier, just by clicking a few buttons. So as long as I've got my resources accounted for in the estimate, and if I'm doing a good, thorough bottoms-up estimate, I'll have resources in there. I can then see how the resources play out in the schedule. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't want to share all of my resources with the client, I understand they might be asking me for some labor, but do I have to show every valve fitting and pipe and skill saw blade and supply that I'm using? No, of course not. I'm going to take us into a setup area in the tool. We're going to go into job properties. We're going to look at some of the schedule options. And you can see this is where we manage what sort of data gets shared between the two tools and in what level of detail. So what we were talking about earlier were resources. And in this case, I've mapped my labor resource type within InEight Estimate over to a resource within the scheduling tool. I can do the same for all of our resource types. You'll notice that this is the only resource that I'm sharing. I'm not, in this case, loading my schedule with equipment, materials, supplies, or uniques. Now, you could make a good case for putting in equipment, going back to the example I used earlier about having a crane, a critical piece of equipment on the job. Maybe it's important that we have some visibility into how we're going to use that crane, etc. So this is one of the data elements that we can share. We can also send over what we would consider to be the price per unit of that resource. We can also send over expenses. So let's go back to our presentation here. So we talked about resource data, the ability to share that. Activity attributes. What do I mean by an activity attribute? Well, think of the way we might want to label certain activities, right? So I said earlier, we might want to isolate, or we might want to identify those things that are going to be done in area 2 of the project. Well, I can label an activity. I say this work's going to be done in area 2. It's going to be done in phase 1 in area 2. So maybe I only want to look at all of the stuff that's happening in area 2 during phase 1 of the project. Very easy to slice and dice the data that way. So those attributes can also go over to the schedule so that someone that enjoys filtering, sorting, grouping data in one tool can enjoy it in the other tool. And this is where we do that mapping. So all of these tags, as we call them, and you can see I've changed the name of a couple of my tags, but these are tag values that would be configured, or these labels rather would be configured. And then we can map these over to specific fields within the scheduling tool. So we can choose if we have, for instance, data in our activity type field in the estimate, we can choose how we want to call that type of work over in the scheduling tool. We can also map into what we call user-defined fields, which are just text entry fields. So if I had a quick little narrative or a note on an activity, I could see that in the scheduling tool as well. So that can become very, very powerful. Again, especially if we've got a project with lots and lots of line items in it, and we're only interested in seeing the few dozen that affect a particular part of the project, we can certainly do that. All right, what else might we want to see? Costs, broken down by category. Maybe it's important for me to see in the scheduling tool, okay, what is my labor component of my cost, equipment, material, subcontractor? We have the ability of sharing progress. Some folks like to collect progress on our side of the fence, the integrated cost estimating, project management side of the fence, and pass that information over to a schedule. Other folks like to collect that data in a scheduling tool and pass that back to our tool. So you'll notice that there's a few options. One says, I'm not interested in percent complete at all. Another option says, capture percent complete using the estimate tool and pass it over to in this case, Primavera, the scheduling tool, or in this case, I want to collect progress, measure progress in the scheduling tool, and have it be brought back to estimate as a result. So again, a lot of options, a lot of flexibility, and it's just really down to what a particular organization wants to do with that data and what are they used to doing. And a lot of times that dictates how we're going to do things in the future. We can also share calendar information. So as you saw when I had an activity configured on the InEight side for a 10-hour day, we computed those hours and we sent those hours over to the schedule for the duration of the activity. We can also manage logic in one system or the other and pass that back and forth. So I think a really good example of that would be maybe I'm doing a key kind of a project. I'm doing a power plant and I've got my cost estimate and I've got my schedule. And this is a part of our business that we're seeing more and more of. Well, what I can do is when that schedule is completed, I can pull all that logic back into InEight Estimate. And then the next time I do a similar project, I can just copy that entire project and I will have all of my activities with the logic already tied together. Push that out to the schedule. And now my starting point is a fully resource loaded, fully logic loaded schedule, as well as a cost loaded estimate. And then I would spend my time updating my rates for materials, subcontractors, labor, equipment, and reviewing my productivity, making sure the scope aligns, if not adjusting the scope in my working estimate to meet the criteria of the project I'm putting together. So that can be very powerful as well, to just store the logic that was produced in the schedule for the next estimating cycle as well. All right. And then the last bullet we've got here is how to easily account for time-based indirect costs. So if you think about a project, you're going to have certain direct work that's going to be done. We're going to get out there and we're going to do some civil work. We're going to do some site work. We're going to pour some concrete. We're going to put a steel structure on top of that concrete. And we need certain things to be out there as those things are happening. So let's jump into the scheduling tool. Here's a section of the schedule called Indirect Supervision. And what I've done, I've used a capability that this tool has called a level of effort. And you can see that my civil superintendent is going to be out there primarily during the performance of all the civil work. I've got a concrete superintendent that's going to come on later and really be responsible for the concrete work. My steel superintendent is going to come out and make sure that the steel is going in properly. But you notice my project manager is there for the duration. All right, and then I've even got some warehouse staff here as well. So the beauty of this is these have predecessors and successors that are basically linked up through the way the schedule comes together. So I've said, I want my concrete superintendent to be there when we start to do the initial fine grading on the first concrete pour. I could have put a negative lag on there and had them there 10 days early. That's beside the point. The example is, as I'm changing the start and finish dates of these activities, as changes occur that are going to push these out or shorten these, the duration of these resources is going to change as well. And that's what their costs are based on. I can see how many hours I've got for the civil superintendent, the concrete superintendent, the structural steel superintendent, and those back on the estimating side are going to equate to costs. So it's very easy now to basically make some changes to my schedule and see how that's going to impact the duration of these supervisory personnel. You can do that with other resources as well. If I know I'm going to need a crane on site from the beginning of this activity until the end of that activity, it's very easy to do. And then what I think we do here in the estimate side is we really tie it all together. So we've now got a view of the project that not only looks at costs and how much is it going to cost us, but we have an understanding of when we're going to experience those costs. So this is my cost curve, and I'll show you some of the options here as well. But this is my planned cost. This is based on the way the schedule is laid out, and it assumes that I'm going to spend that money every day. And you can see that I've got this nice drawn out S-curve. There's a few things I can do. First of all, I know we've got some Excel folks in the room. We always do. I just clicked a little worksheet button. And so when I open up Excel, It's going to show me monthly what my spend is. Okay, so maybe there's someone in my organization that's interested in that information. Maybe it's my accountant. Maybe it's my finance officer. Maybe that person is going to go down and talk to the bonding agent and talk about our capacity to get bonded, et cetera. So that's good information to see. Another piece of information that I'd be interested in looking at would be my revenue associated with the project. So it's one thing to say, well, here's what my cost curve looks like. What does my price curve look like? Am I going to get paid for this stuff? And, at the end of the day, am I going to get paid more than I'm spending? Well, good. There's a healthy gap between those two. But we also know that we don't get paid every day for the work that we're doing, right? There's payment terms, there's rules of credit. We have to say, well, we're going to earn so much of this revenue when X gets done. We're going to earn so much more of it when Y gets done. So if we run back to our job properties and we take a look at some of those setup options, this is a set of questions that helps us identify the timing of our revenue. So when are we going to get paid? Do we submit a bill to the client at the end of the job? Do we submit a bill to the client every month? And if so, on what day? Do we bill every 2 weeks? Do we bill every 16 days? So this is very configurable. We can also specify how long we wait to get paid and if there's going to be any retainage released. And if so, when is that retainage released? Is it released at the end of the project? Is it released on a specific date? And then we can do the same thing with the timing of our costs. So there's going to be certain costs. There are going to be certain costs that we don't pay for daily, like subcontracts, materials, et cetera. When do we get invoiced from those folks? How long do we wait before we pay them? What sort of retainage are we holding? And then this can even go so far as to helping us understand what it costs us if we need to dip into a line of credit. What is the annual interest rate that we're going to pay to borrow money? And if we happen to have any extra surplus cash laying around, are we going to earn any interest on that as well? So what's kind of cool about that is we can jump back to our cash flow graph and we can see these nice, smooth, planned lines, but we can also come in and say, well, the planned lines are great, but what I'm really interested in is when we're going to get paid and when I have cash going out of my organization. And you can see these flatten out quite a bit. They're much more stair-step in terms of how we're going to get paid for the different types of work we're doing. And this would be a very interesting point to me. This is the point at which our revenues exceed our costs and stay out ahead of our cost curve for the duration of the project. So I'll be behind the 8 ball up until almost Halloween, it looks like, October 31st, 2019. And then from that point forward, I can see that my revenue is in excess of my costs. So those are great things to be able to see ahead of time before we even submit a bid. I've had customers anecdotally tell me, hey, our business development team has kind of negotiated a price with the client already. But so there's not a lot of wiggle room there. But one of the things that they are open to is exploring different payment terms. So it's very easy to come back into the project and fiddle with some of these cash flow settings. Well, what if we didn't wait an entire month to bill the client? What if we were able to bill every 2 weeks? What would that do to our cash situation? As an example, right? So rather than staying up all night figuring this out using Excel, I can see that moved my line back a few days. So that's good news. And it decreased the discrepancy between my cash in and my cash out. So I'm not as exposed as a result. So a lot of good things we can analyze here. Another thing we can look at. So we can look at resource distribution. So if I were interested in seeing what my labor curve looks like across the project, I can see we kind of start off small, then we ramp up, and then we ramp back down. And then I could also dial this in and look at certain types of labor. Show me just my concrete people, show me my civil people, show me my structural steel people, et cetera. This can be particularly helpful if we're doing a project that has mobilization costs. Maybe we're in a remote area where we have to set up a camp. I really would be interested in knowing what my peak looks like because that's what we have to plan for, right? Is that peak. And then we might also look at this and say, well, gosh, we're going to really scale down. We're going to ramp back up. Is there a way to get into the schedule and look at those activities and maybe take a fresh look at how we can sequence these activities where we have more or less constant demand for our resources once we get started? If I'm going to have to pay for a 400-man camp, Do I really want to have it underutilized where there's only 85 people staying there at any given time? Or is there a way I can, again, move the activities around in the schedule, change some of those logic relationships to have a little bit more consistent utilization of those resources? So time-based indirect costs, we talked about this with respect to staff personnel. We had, another example could be a trailer, temporary facility rentals. It would work the same way, right? I need that trailer there from the day we mobilize to the day we pull our equipment off. And as I'm changing those dates around, it's going to change the length of that trailer rental and add it to my estimate automatically. We talked about support crews and equipment. We certainly talked about project management being there for the duration as well. So again, this takes advantage of a particular set of tools in the scheduling application known as a level of effort. You can do the same thing with Microsoft Project. It just has an extra step, but you can certainly tie those activities to the starts and finishes of other activities and really understand what it's going to cost. Well, it seems like we just got started and here we are at the thank you slide. Again, thank you for attending. I hope you got something meaningful and helpful out of this, whether you're using our tools or not. Maybe there's something that come Monday morning when you're back in the office, you can put to work initially and really get some value out of this. Any questions, by all means, feel free to light up our email webinars at InEight.com. I think our team's doing a great job of putting the recorded webinars out on the website. So by all means, if you missed one, go get caught up. They're pretty easy to watch direct. You can also download them if you like. And that's it from here. So I appreciate you coming out and hope you learned something. And we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. To learn more about InEight as well as our project cost management solutions, visit InEight.com and click on the Request a Demo button. And if you'd like to see a schedule of upcoming webinars, visit InEight.com/webinars. Thank you for watching. This concludes our presentation.